Ave Maria, welcome once again to the Divine Mercy TV. Today, we're going to talk about something that is very controversial. It's about the question on suffering. So we're going to ponder on the question, if there is a God who loves and cares for all of us, why is there suffering in the world? So it's a question often used by atheists to debunk or to disprove the existence of God. And not only by atheists, even by some believers who are experiencing a really deep sorrow or some sufferings that are almost unbearable. So this question we'll seek to answer. But let me give you a thrill. Actually, the question about suffering, the existence of suffering, does not disprove the existence of God. It even elevates it, or it even provides more proof, more logical argument why there is God. And we'll see to that. We'll see to it. We'll see about that after some points to be discussed first. Now, let's go on the question, why is there suffering if there is a God who loves and cares for us? The answer is this. Let me give you the straight answer. Let's go straight to the point. The answer is that because God is justice. And that's the reason why there is suffering, because God is justice. Let's take a brief pause. We'll go back to this point later. But as of now, I think it is important to answer the why. So let's talk about the why there is suffering. And the why can be understood better once we understand about human nature. So the first point before the pause, we'll talk about justice, and then we'll move back to that later. Now we're talking about the why point, the why we suffer, and that can be better understood by understanding human nature. And obviously I don't need to explain about what human means, but I think there's a need to expound about nature. What does nature means? When we say nature, that means something that is original to a being. So any existent being, its original or its very core of what it is supposed to be, that is nature. What it is supposed to be, what a being is supposed to be, or what a being is all about. That's nature. Let's say, for example, a dog. So the nature of a dog is what dogness is all about. Like, it barks and it wiggles its tails. Just one example. But we'll go to man, since we're talking about the suffering experienced by man. Now, the thing is this. If the nature of man desires for happiness, something that I'm using as a counterpoint to suffering, I would say happiness. Now, in the very nature of man, I would say, when we talked about nature a while ago, that is something that's original. In the original state of man, we don't desire suffering, we desire happiness. And happiness is acquired once we possess the true, the good, and the beautiful. If what we experience is not true, not good, and not beautiful, then we become sad, we suffer, we cease to be happy. These three, the true, the good, and the beautiful, are desired by man. And above that man being capable of desiring, above this ability to desire, there is a thing called freedom. And freedom is part of nature, is innate in man. It is in the very nature of man. It's part of who we are and what we are as man, that we are a free being. And this freedom, we use it to acquire the desire of our heart. And that's what we said a while ago, the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that these three, once they are obtained, then we become happy. And once they are objected or somehow neglected, or something that is not attained, once they're not attained, then we become sad or we suffer. But then we are asking about the question, the why we suffer. Now, as we said, nature is that which is original, and that which is original is not desired to be set aside or to be pushed away. We don't want to get rid of our nature, of our very nature. But if something that comes to us that is not part of our nature, we would want to get rid of it, like we push it away. Let me give you an example. If I would seek to remove your hand, you won't like it. You will suffer for it. You would hate it, and you would be sad about it, since you know that it's part of your nature that I'm taking away from you, and you don't want that to happen. But if there will be a dirt in your face, and I will clean that dirt, I will remove that from your face, you will be happy for it. Like you would be thankful even to me. You would even be thankful to me by removing the dirt from your face. And that is because you know that such a dirt is not part of your nature. Same thing with suffering. Since we don't want suffering, since we want to get rid of suffering, it's not part of our nature. So anything that is not desired and that is not in line with the rational appetite of man is not part of the human nature. Now, since suffering is not desired, then obviously it's not part of the human nature. But then it is true that it exists. That is, it is experienced by all men. And that means there must have been something. There must have been a primary cause for this suffering, for this destructive suffering to exist or to be experienced by man. There must have been a primary cause for this, since we already understood that it is not part of nature. So that means suffering is not original in man, and it means it is only inflicted in man. And if it was inflicted in man, logically it follows that it must have been the first man, and not just any man, since we all experience it now. We inherit this experience of suffering. So this first suffering, the first cause, the primary cause of suffering, must have been inflicted on the very first man. That is the logical inference, I would say. It follows from the experience that it is experienced by all. Then it must have been experienced by the first man, first of all. So the first cause, or the primary cause of suffering, must have been inflicted on the first man. But then we might wonder, what was that primary cause? What was that kind of experience, the first cause of suffering? I mean, the very cause why the first man began to suffer. What was that thing? That first cause, or that very cause of suffering, must have been something that is against the nature of man, against the rational appetite of man. So that is against the true, the good, and the beautiful. So since it is against these three, that must have been not true, not good, and not beautiful. That must have been ugliness, evilness, and lie. So in short, man used his freedom to embrace this kind of lie, to embrace this kind of ugliness, to embrace man of things in line with his rational appetite, that is to provide himself with the true, the good, and the beautiful. But when man take on something that is not true, not good, and not beautiful, then he misuses his freedom, like he is using it in the wrong way. It's a wrong turn. So it's not anymore causing him to be happy. And since this type of cause of suffering is causing man to experience sadness, and it is called an abuse of freedom, so therefore it was a failure to acknowledge dignities, failure to acknowledge dignities according to the hierarchies of being. That means at that very moment, man began to deceive himself. What was that type of deception, since it was a lie? It was a deception in such a way that he failed to acknowledge that his existence had a beginning and therefore had a cause. So at that very moment, man thought of himself as the highest being and therefore rejected the highness of the cause of his existence. That was the very first experience of suffering, and we all inherit that. That is precisely the reason why we suffer. That is precisely the reason why there is suffering in the world. That very first act of deception of the self committed by the first man. Now, let's go back to the question on justice. Like, if God is a loving God and He cares for us, why would He allow man to suffer? And as we said in the very first part of the discussion, that the reason is that because God is justice. And why would being justice means allowing suffering? The answer is this: because God, being a God of justice, cannot go, because He will not. Cannot go, not because He doesn't have the power to do so, but He will not go against the freedom He gave to man. And when God gave man the freedom to choose for himself the true, the good, and the beautiful, and even the freedom to do the contrary, God will not go against that. He cannot but allow it. And the suffering experienced by man was not caused by God. It was caused by man's choice. And God cannot but allow that, because He is a God of justice. And if He would go against the freedom that He gave to man, that kind of freedom ceases to be a freedom. It is no longer freedom, since it is now enslaved by a master above. It is now controlled by God. But God cannot do that, and He will not do that. He cannot, not because He doesn't have the power to do so, but He will not do so. That is because He is justice. And another thing about justice is that this God being justice would require a repair or a reparation for this destruction. And since it was committed by man, it must be repaired by man. And that is precisely the reason why the Son of God became man. It was an act of justice. So obviously it was an act of love, it was an act of mercy, but undeniably it was an act of justice. That this is what justice demands. that something that is destroyed by man must be repaired by man. Now let's go to the question about the caring God and a loving God. A caring and a loving God. Is He not loving? Is He not caring when He allows us to suffer? Well, He cares for us and He loves us still. And He does it in such a way that is not contradicting our freedom. So how did He do it? He gave prophets in the Old Testament to give hope to His people. He promised salvation, and that salvation came through Jesus Christ to show us the way back to the Father, to be in perfect union with Him once again in that heaven prepared for us who believes in His Son Jesus Christ. So let me tell all atheists listening now, and even those who are having these same questions in mind, these same questions as the atheists do. Don't worry that you're suffering now, because suffering has an end. No one suffers for all eternity, being a man with flesh and bones, because obviously we will all die. So suffering has an end. And if you want to be happy, if you want to be perfectly happy, or if you want to be without suffering, just do everything to be in heaven. Strive to be in heaven, because in heaven there is no suffering. And God promised that for all of us, because this promise of heaven is a promise of a loving and caring God in such a way that is not going against our freedom. And He did everything to bring us back to that perfect state wherein there is no more suffering. He did everything. And that everything is provided through the Catholic Church that He founded 2,000 years ago. Now, is God not caring? Is He not loving? Is He not doing anything? When you say God doesn't care, doesn't love, that means He did not do anything to bring us back to the perfect state of happiness, to bring us back to the state without suffering. But then He did everything. He even poured out everything. He even shed all of His blood just to bring us back to that perfect state. That's how He cares for us. That's how He loves all of us. And since I promised in the first part of the discussion to provide arguments as to why suffering even proves the existence of God and does not disprove it, the reason can be found in connection to the discussion about nature, that since there is suffering, it must have been inflicted on the first man. And what was the type of suffering? It was a failure to acknowledge the truth. It was a self-deception that man is just a creature, that man's existence had a beginning. So it must have been a failure to acknowledge the truth that there is a cause for man's existence. And this cause therefore must be true, since suffering is true. Suffering is true because the failure to acknowledge the cause of man's existence is true. Then it must be true as well that man's existence really has a cause, and we call that cause God. Now you see, suffering is not disproving God's existence. It's pointing to the existence of God. That what causes suffering is the denial of God's truth, is the denial that God is the cause of our existence. That what caused the very first suffering. That was the very first experience of suffering. Suffering is not disproving God's existence, as you can see. And I hope that's clear enough. Thank you so much for your patient listening. God bless you all. Ave Maria. Pray always. Strive to be